we're going to work on the standard pleat. So we talked in the last video about ruffles, little accentuated point on the end, usually at the end of a garment, a hem or sleeve, etc. A little flounce, a little decorative moment. A gathered ruffle tends to be softer and fuller. If you want something that may or may not be as full, maybe a little more structured, but still give that fullness and that softness in a slightly different way, then you might look at doing a pleated ruffle instead of gathered. We're going to talk about two pleats. Right now we're going to talk about the standard pleat. So once again, we have our 6x6 square fabric. And this one, as a number of these things, the technique will be the same, but measurements could be different. Right now I've got about a 12.5 inch piece of by 3-inch piece of fabric that we're going to pleat into a pleated ruffle to attach to our 6-inch square. So what you're going to need is you're going to need a ruler, measuring device of some type, and you're going to need a marking pen, marking pencil, something that you can mark increments with. For this particular pleat, we're going to mark 1-inch increments. So every inch you want to make a line. If you want, you can make it a full line that goes all the way across the fabric, or you could just mark the top. You just want to make sure that you have consistent marks that are easy to read. Now for this pleat, so we've marked our marks. We've got little blue guys here. And in order to create the pleat, we're going to take the first two marks, we're going to match them together, and then fold that fabric behind there. Right? So we marked them at 1 inch. If we match them and fold that back, we've now created a 1/2 inch pleat. And then we'll put a pin in there to secure it. And ideally, the pleat is going to be the same from top to bottom, which might be why you might want to make your lines go from top to bottom, or you might want to mark the bottom. Either way, because these should lay flat. Most of the time, they're going to be flat. If you press them flat, they're often called knife pleats. If you let them kind of be soft and round, it's just a pleated ruffle. So next, we're going to skip over to the next set and do the same thing. We're essentially folding that first line and then bringing it over to our second line. And then the more precisely you match these, the more evenly spaced and well constructed your ruffle will be. Now this can vary with how deep the ruffle is, like I said, or how deep the pleat is. I've marked 1-inch increments and we're folding those in half, so it's creating a 1/2 inch pleat. And the way that we've got these laid out, they're also about a 1/2 inch apart. So you see there's some space between each pleat. If we had marked in the middle of these, or if we skipped to every other one, so now I've created a 1-inch pleat here. And if I skip the one in the middle here, I can make another 1-inch pleat, and I've made them so they're right next to each other. So that's just a variation. So, and you see, when they're right next to each other, we have even more fullness. And when they're deeper, that creates a fuller ruffle than this side where they're not as deep and they're more spaced out. You see the difference? So what you're trying to achieve with your ruffle is going to determine how deep the pleat is, and if you go every other one or every one to make them either butt right up against each other or separated. Okay. I just want you guys to understand the pattern here. So we are just doing every other one, and we're doing the 1/2 inch with some spacing. And you can experiment with this, in another assignment. You can add I don't know, you can add a ruffle to your vest. I don't know why you would, but you could. Um, you'll often see this application on younger girls' dresses. We see it in a fair amount of period garments. but we don't see it as much. I would see it in home decor maybe a little bit more than garments lately. All right, so now I've got all of my pleats in. You see how evenly spaced they are. You see how they're the same depth going across. So that's one of the things I'll be looking for. I'll be looking for evenly spaced pleats that go that have the same depth, etc. So now what we would do here is if this was, and from here we make a standard seam just like we did with the gather. So we're going to take our ruffle and we'd be attaching it to our garment here. And as I stated before, that would very often be a hem or a sleeve. So it'd very often be in a circle. We don't have to worry about matching centers here because the pleated ruffle is generally just going to be properly sized, because you can use measurements to determine how far they are, how spaced out they are, so that you can calculate so that it's the right size. Now, if you just wanted to make a giant pleated ruffle and then fit it in, then you might mark anchor points, but you don't really need to because it's just going to lay flat, as it's almost like it's a flat piece of fabric to stitch like a regular seam, just happens to have some folds in it. Now what I like to do is you see I've matched my edges in my little corner here. So next I'm going to pin this all together. And instead of adding more pins, I have each pleat pin down here. So I'm just going to hold that in place and I'll take the pin out and then repin it, but I'll go through both layers, right? So that's the easiest way to do this so that you aren't just creating a giant pin monster. Like I shifted a little, so I'm just fixing it as I go. And again, just like any standard pleat, I'm wanting my edges to match up so that we've got a nice clean finished edge. All right. So now I've got that pinned together just like a standard seam. I'm going to stitch a standard seam. I've got my stitch length at 2.5. I'll put my fabric in so that I'm lining up at 5/8 of an inch. I start with my needle in the fabric, press her foot down. It's a construction stitch, so I'll take, let's move our pin. I'll take a couple of stitches, back stitch, and go on through. Now, the way that this is folded, it's fortunate that it's folded away from the foot. So as the foot goes, it's going to help that pleat lay flat. If these pleats were folded the other direction, then you'd want to be careful that the edge of the foot didn't go underneath your pleat. Like I said, just sewing basically a standard seam here. Get to the end, back stitch. My needle, I happen to stop my needle so my looper's up so I don't have to turn my hand wheel. So clip. And we would have sewn this right sides together. But if we look, so there's our pleated, that's our standard pleat. So that's a pleated ruffle. So you see, when compared to the gathered ruffle, they're still creating a little ruffle, but this one's got a little bit more structure, whereas this one's a little bit softer. And just like with the gather, we're going to press our seam up. And very often, Well, it's not even very often. It really just is depending on the design and what you're trying to achieve. So this is what it looks like when we just press the top part. If you want that knife pleat look, that really sharp pleat, like, then you'd want to make sure that your pleats were laying down completely perfectly flat and straight from top to bottom. And then you can have this really kind of sharp. So this takes some of that softness out. It gives you this really hard edge. So you can press them either way. I tend to like to leave them so they're a little softer and more rounded, but there might be a character and or a style or something you're trying to achieve where you want that really sharp structure, and that might be where you might use this knife pleat technique. All right, so that is a standard pleated ruffle. And one of the things that makes it this just a when you just ask for a pleated ruffle, this is essentially what people are going to are expecting, where all the folds are equidistant, they're all facing the same direction. So that's what you get with your standard pleat.